this situated here first. Let me pull out again my very technical help here, because retention better if it's on paper, right? I think that's a biased study, though. I'd like to see where they got it from. I feel like people who decide to read from a paper book are probably higher chance of remembering things than the rest of us who are like, meh. I don't know. I'm just saying the study seems suspicious. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, right? It's definitely suspicious. All right. All right, perfect. So, one, I want to thank all the men that came out to the Men's Day yesterday. We had a great time. It was wonderful. God really blessed us with beautiful weather. I wasn't soaked when we got done playing disc golf. It was amazing. The weather was beautiful. It was a beautiful area up there. For those who just love to be in nature, you could not have been more in nature than we were on the side of a mountain. It was amazing. And, Bommy and I took on JJ and another person from southern New Hampshire, Parker, and they were, they were bringing their game, but Bommy and I came out victorious. So, we brought the win home, and that's what matters. We brought the win home, and Bob witnessed and gave us the golf clap. His hands were so tired after all the golf clapping. It was great. But it was great to have a time together as men. I know we have women's days and we have all these days and stuff, and it's just wonderful to get together and celebrate the things that make us different, right? The things that we are all great and loved, but we are different. We have differences that differences that need to be met by other people of the same gender, right? So it's like, oh yeah, like Amber, we joked that Amber and I, we can just don't get each other. We're different. Yeah, I'm not a woman, and Amber's not a man, and so that creates things, right? But what I love about God is He takes all of us, right? He loves every one of us, and He created us specifically to be the way that we are. This morning, as you sit there this morning, and if you're like me, I could say you're amazing, right? I could say every one of you is the most amazing person in the world, and if you're like me and your head's going, yeah, but he don't know about this, and he don't know about that, and he don't know, right? Well, I did this, and today I yelled at somebody in traffic, or whatever it is. We immediately go to the negative, right? You are amazing. God made you amazing. He knitted you in the womb, and He designed you to be who you are, right? And in all the situations and things that we have in life, God works, I always say God works to do the most good, the best, most good He can in any scenario, right? So wherever you're at, He's working to do the most good possible, right? And I get the joy this morning of going over Ruth chapter 2. And my lesson, if you want to, I don't have any points necessarily. I've just got a title, and we're going to get into it. But if you want a title, it's Ruth and Boaz, a tale of two fortunes. Okay? And we're going to start off just because reading Ruth chapter 2, right? We're just going to read right through it so we have an understanding of where we're at. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind. Anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes of rest in the shelter." Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. I hope I continue to please you, sir, she replied. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time. So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. Where did you gather all this grain today? Naomi asked. Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, The man I worked with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him, Naomi told her daughter-in-law. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. Then Ruth said, What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed. Good, Naomi exclaimed. Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him. So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So that's a great story, right? Like, just like if you don't even know the rest of the story, like that's a pretty amazing story, right? Like living with her mother-in-law, she's not from there, she's a foreigner, and going out to pig fields, and like this amazing thing happens, right? Get some more water. This amazing thing happens to them, and Boaz shows them kindness. And as we learned last week when Bami was telling us about Ruth and how they got to here, it was Naomi. They went off. This time of the judges. There was famine in the land. They went off to another land. The dad died. The sons died. Everybody died, but the women, which is just rude, because just everybody did. And nothing but the women were left. And Naomi said, the only thing left for me is to go back home where I'm from. And she told Ruth and Orpah to go back to your people. And Ruth was like, nope, I'm going to follow you and I'm going to follow your God, right? That was the first act of faith right there for Naomi, right? Is that Ruth, she was like, I'm going to follow you and follow your God. Like, your God will be my God, right? And I don't know what it was up until that point that she had seen, like she was a Moabite. And like that could cause strife between the Israelites and things. So like I don't know what she had seen in their household. I'm sure she'd seen the love of God and like hey, this is something. But she decided at that moment, like I'm going to put my faith in your God, right? And when you look at that, like this first act of faith of Naomi and Ruth is to go back. Because again, we were at a time of famine, right? But I don't know how, as far as from the time like the sons died till they decided to go back. But what's interesting is they got to Bethlehem just in time for the barley harvest, which happens earlier than the wheat harvest, right? That generally happens in like April. So like just right there, you see like normally, agriculturally speaking, like there's not so many things that you harvest early, but barley is one of the things. And so like the time frame just working out, they didn't come at the end of the harvest, they got there right at the time, right? And I just think, that's one of those things where you see God like lining up and moving, right? The first thing she said, I'm going to have faith, we're going to go and follow you. And it just happened to be, they got there right at the time for the beginning of the barley harvest. I don't know if it was planned I'm sure they didn't plan their husbands to die, but when they left, I don't know what was planned, but like that's where they ended up. And like that was great, right? And it's important to know that, right? The timing was perfect. And you then see, she says, Ruth says to Naomi, like, hey, I'm going to go and pick up any grain that is left over. If anyone, in anyone's eyes, do I find favor, right? Because remember, these were two unmarried women at the time. They had less than no rights, right? They're like the only, it even talks about Boaz being their kinsman redeemer. Like, the only way that they could have anything is if a man claimed them and took care of them, right? Like, there weren't a lot of options, you know. But I love how in this God says, you know, okay, the options that you have, like, you've got faith in me, and here's what we're going to do. So I've got to think of Naomi in this situation going, okay, I don't know how old she was in there, but Ruth says she wants to go, she knows that she can go and try and glean what's left of the fields, right? And she wants to do that. And, like, that's dangerous, you know? Just to be honest, like, you hear Boaz saying, you know, don't go to other fields, it could be bad. I told my men not to treat you roughly, right, and not treat you poor. Like, this is it's a step of faith. Like, they didn't have a lot of choices, but, you know, Ruth was like, I'm going to go out, right? I'm going to trust God. I'm going to go out and I'm going to see if whoever will find favor. And Naomi had to say, yep, go do that, because, you know, again, there was no law for them. There was no one protecting them unless someone took it upon their heart to protect them. And, you know, Ruth, a young woman in a time like that without a husband, could have very well been taken advantage of in any number of ways, right? So, like, just the faith that they had, and like, can say faith, and also just out of necessity, right? They didn't have a lot. They were like, hey, we got to do something, right? Like, and of the choices, they chose this choice, right? And it took, you know, it took that, like, okay, we're going to trust in God, we're going to do this, and we're going to go with that, right? And then the reason I say we have the tale of two fortunes is because what do we see here, right? When it introduces Boaz to us in chapter 2, in verse 1, it says, now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, right? So Boaz was wealthy and influential, right? He had land, he had crops, he had money, and he had influence over people, right? Which arguably that's just as important back then, to, you know, have that influence. So he had that influence in there, right? But he had faith in God, right? And you can see, like, you know, you look at this and you're trying to think of, like, okay, well, how did Boaz have faith, right? Where was Boaz's faith in all this? By some accounts, you could say he saw a pretty young woman in his fields and was like, take care of her, and I'm going to, you know, be nice, and maybe it will work to, you know, I'll take her as a wife or whatever it is, right? But what I love about this is Boaz, being a wealthy and influential man, you know, he kind of set the tone. Like, the fact that he came back, you know, to his workers and said, you know, the Lord, you know, be with you, and they said, the Lord bless you, right? And what's important to know is if you look in Deuteronomy, verse 24:19, this is one of the, you know, it tells you, when you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do, right? And similarly, in Leviticus 19:9-10, it says, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. Right? So these were commands to, you know, hey, this is welfare system, if you will. God's like, hey, listen, don't take everything, right? Don't leave stuff for the orphans, the widows, the poor, you know, the foreigners, right? And you look at that and you're like, okay, what we know is this was a time of famine, right? And I can imagine in a time of famine, like, I don't know if you guys get this, when you broke, you hold on to every dollar tightly. Like, there's no, like, when you feel wealthy, you're like, oh, I can spend freely, and there's money in the bank. It's like, oh, we'll do this, and we can do this, and we can be extra. But when the times are tight, you want to tighten down, right? But Boaz here didn't. He said, no, he's still allowed, said, no, we're gonna do this, we're gonna allow people to come through, like, you know, and it such to the point that, like, his workers, like his foreman, the foreman knew that Boaz was been like, no, let them glean, right? Like that, his love and faith in God permeated all throughout his workers, right? Because he had faith that even though in time of famine, that if he didn't glean all of it, that he would still be provided for. The Lord would bless him, right? And like, man, that's tough, right? Like, you know, even though he was wealthy, this was a time of famine. And like, dude, that right there takes such faith just to set that tone, to set that idea, to have that, you know. I imagine he was a good boss. It seems like he had a great relationship with his workers, right? And like, that takes faith, right? And I know a lot of us in times are like, oh yeah, when times are easy, you know, we can be giving, we can be loving, and we can do the thing, right? But like, when times are tough, it's hard to have faith in God. I know I want to be like, well, times are tough. I've got to buckle down. I've got to do this. I've got to make sure. I've got to cut this. We've got to do this. And it's like, is that having faith in me or having faith in God? And you see here that Boaz was having faith in God. And I love that because, you know, we can read through this and you see Ruth, and Ruth had great faith, right? And Boaz doesn't, you know, we get like he was the kinsman redeemer and like he did all this, you know, great stuff, but I think his faith doesn't get, you know, applauded as much because it takes faith in this time to do these things, right? To say, no, we're going to be okay. I don't know what the crops were looking like, but he had faith to do this, and he set that tone, right? Number two, Ruth was a Moabite, right? So she was a foreigner. They didn't, you know, going to my southern roots, we don't really take too kind of those people around here, you know. Let's keep them out, right? And he was a man of influence, right? But he allowed a Moabite woman, a Moabitess, to come in and like glean from his fields. And not only glean, but give her some special favor, right? And I don't know what that did for like his standing with the other men, like what they thought about that, what people of the time would have thought about him showing kindness to this Moabite. And like obviously it had been talked about. People knew that Naomi and like Ruth had come back. It was known she was a Moabite. Like this wasn't anything, but you know, he decided like, no, I'm going to do this. And I don't know, again, I don't think he was concerned about his reputation. He was just he had faith that the Lord would bless and that if he did the right thing, right? And you know, he decided to go above and beyond because he recognized her loyalty to Naomi, right? He's like, hey, look, you did this. You left your people. You left your gods. You came here to follow Naomi and to follow our gods. And I believe in Ruth in 2:10-12, he follows up and says, Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? What have I done? I'm just a Moabite woman. I am only a foreigner, right? Like I don't have any, like not only am I a woman, so I have no stake in anything, I'm a foreigner as well. So that's like, I would say 2, but that's like 3 strikes against you, right? And he said, yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done, right? And what I love about this, what I love about Boaz's observation here is that he recognized her faith in God, right? And he didn't sit there and say, she's got faith in God. God will reward her. I'm going to sit back and wait, right? You know, I think he saw the opportunity to show God's love with what he has, right? And even so, he said, you know, I'm going to do this, and may God continue to bless you for what you have done. Like, you've taken refuge in his wings, and may he bless you for it, right? And so, like, part of that blessing was him. And I think for us, you know, I think a lot of us are very fortunate in our lives, you know, financially and friendship-wise, and we're all just very fortunate here, right? And I think if we look at it, a lot of us can very much feel like Boaz. And I think, I like this, I want to remember this as I'm moving forward, is like, when I see people, and I'm like, man, I hope God blesses them, and I think, what if I'm the blessing that God is trying to give, right? Like, what if I see this person who is like reaching out and I'm like, you know what? I might not be the full blessing, but I can do something. Right? And I like that Boaz, had that faith. He's like, he recognized her faith and said, because of your faith, I'm going to do what I can. May the Lord continue to bless you, right? He didn't, it's not only like, hey, I'm it. He said, Lord, continue to bless you. So like, I think for us, as we go through, our lives, just remember that like, maybe we are the blessing. Maybe we're fortunate. Maybe we're fortunate so we can allow someone to glean from our fields and not just glean to say, hey, drop a couple, leave some extra, make sure they're taken care of, don't mess with them, right? And like, that takes faith, right? Boaz is a great example here of faith. Yeah. And how he did that with his fortune and wealth and influence that he had, right? And I think it's something we can all emulate and that we should emulate, being a blessing where we can. And it says in verse 17, it says that, he instructed them to like drop some wheat or like drop some heads of barley and do this and let her glean among the sheaves and all this stuff. And at the end of it, the end of the day, she had picked, after they had done the threshing floor, she had roughly an ephah of grain, which is about 30 pounds. Like, I think of a 30-pound sack of rice. Like, that's a big bag of rice, right? Like, that's, and I don't know what his fields look like. I don't know, but that's not an insignificant portion to say here. Like, that's, I'm like, maybe that's like dropping couple $100 bills and being like, just let her find them. Like, that's not an insignificant amount. It's not like she got enough to eat for the day. 30 pounds is a lot, And again, I can only speculate or imagine what the conditions were. But I think Boaz had faith in God that if he did the right thing, that he would be blessed. And he wanted to pass on that blessing, right? So Boaz, fortunate, wealth, and how he used faith or how he had faith in God with his wealth to be a blessing and to not possibly succumb to peer pressure, to worry about what people would think, of a Moabitess and all this stuff, right? He was like, nope, I'm going to do what I need to do. But we also have the tale of Ruth and her fortune, right? And what did Ruth do? How did Ruth have faith in God? Because Ruth had nothing. Like, nothing. The only Social Security or welfare was, go out into the fields and pick what was left over, right? And you've got to figure out how to make it through the winter and like all this stuff. You've got to pour up, you've got to like save up. And as I alluded to earlier, Ruth didn't have a husband. And she said, let me go into the fields, She had no husband, and that could have ended up poorly for her, right? That could have ended not well. But she had faith, and again, in a new land, right? And maybe she's just like going out on faith on the God. Like, hey, I'm going to follow your God. I'm going to do this, like, new land. I'm just going to go and hope I find fortune. Maybe she didn't know the full, dangers. I imagine she did. But it took a lot of faith to say, hey, I'm going to do this. I've committed to following Naomi. I've committed to following her God. I've got nothing. I'm going to go and see if someone will just let me pick up, what's left. And I think, one, that takes a lot of faith. And two, that takes a lot of humility, right? And I know for me specifically, if in a lot of ways, I'm totally okay to ask for help. If it's something that I know I don't know, or like, yeah, I don't know how to do this, somebody help me. But if I feel like it's something that I have control over, or I could control, then like, no, I don't want your help, because then I don't really know what it is. I'll just feel like I didn't do it, or like I'm not okay, or I'm not deserving, or whatever, right? So like, if I was down and out financially and like couldn't make rent, I don't know that I could ask for money to help, right? I don't know that I could ask for that. It would be so hard for me for a myriad of reasons. But I love Ruth here showing like, hey, listen, this is where I'm at. I'm trusting in God, and I'm trusting that God's going to provide. I'm going to go ask, see whoever I can find favor in, right? Whoever will allow me to glean from their fields. And like for me, again, like just as Boaz was a great example, I'm like, Ruth is a great example, because we've all been up, we've all been down. And when we're down, sometimes we just need that humility to say, hey, look, I need help, right? And it doesn't even have to be financial. It can be whatever it is today. Whether it's whether it's your sin, whether it's just struggle with just people, like a job, anything like that. You're trying ask for help. I think that it almost takes more faith to say, hey, to reach out and ask for help, right? Because that's admitting that you need it. That's admitting that in some ways, whatever the insecurities are, that you're going to need it. But Ruth, no problem. She said, hey, listen, I'm going to go see whose fields I find favor in, right? And then when Boaz gets there, he says, hey, who is that young woman out there, right? So his foreman told her, said, hey, look, she came and asked this morning if she could glean from the fields. And I told her, fine. I said, she's been out there since this morning until now, right? Except a small rest in the shed or whatever they call it, a rest in the barn or whatever. And I look at that and I'm like, wow, okay. So she was down, but she said, hey, look, someone gave me favor. I'm going to go out and I'm going to work, right? She said she's been out there dusk to dawn. She's been going at it, right? And I think I was looking at that and I was like, man, I'm torn on two places because I'm like, sometimes, God will bless us. God blesses us through no action of our own, right? It's gifts from God, but sometimes it's that, hey, we're getting out there, we're doing work, we're willing to work, we're willing to do the hard work, the hard part of it, and because of that, more blessings can come, right? She didn't just sit around and say, hey, who will give me money? She said, hey, listen, who will just let me glean from the fields? I don't mind going to do the work. I don't mind doing this, the hard part. I don't mind doing that. Just somebody take enough pity on me to let me do that, right? And I think, that's that great story of hey, listen, pull up by the bootstraps, right? Like that, we get that, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. And that's kind of what Ruth did here. She pulled herself up by the bootstraps. And I think it speaks a lot to our hustle culture in America, right? We're like, hey, listen, if you're not wealthy, it's because you're not hustling hard enough. You're not putting, I could see so many sermons on she was in the field from morning to night. She never stopped. She was out there, all this stuff, right? And the thing is, what I love that they throw about this, in verse 7, in the second half, it says, she asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelters, right? Even Ruth knew, even in this time of hey, look, she doesn't have anything. She's going on the generosity of others. Even she recognized, hey, you need a rest, right? You can't just muscle your way through life, right? Yes, we got to get out there, and help and doing whatever, but everybody needs rest. And I know it's hard to feel that way when we're on the down, when we're unfortunate, when the money's not there or the whatever. We feel well, if I just need to work 3 jobs, I just need to do 4 jobs, I just need to do this. It's that's putting your faith back on you and not putting faith in God. Yes, we need to, do work and do whatever, but Ruth knew, no, you got to have a rest. We've got to let ourselves rest. And in that rest, maybe that's the time you pray to God, you feel whatever. Maybe that's when you see God, when you put that faith hey, I know what I need, or I know, but as I rest, God will still bless me, right? This is not taking away. This is me doing, because even God rested on the 7th day, right? And I love that. I just love that example of Ruth. Willing to go out there, willing to do the work, but also showed us the point, it's not showed because it's a very small part of the chapter, but I don't want to gloss over it. She rested. You know what I mean? She didn't have food, she didn't have a grocery store she could go to. This was her lifeline. Not only hers, it was Naomi's lifeline. She was working for both of them, but she still took time to rest. And I just love that little piece there, because it's God created the entire earth and universe and everything, and on the 7th day he rested, and how important that is. And even in here, she sees the importance and the need for rest. Now, she didn't sleep all day. It was a couple of minutes, but it was rest nonetheless, right? And I think, again, that's having that faith in God, right? And she was humble, right? Again, that takes faith to be humble, to just say, hey, look, I'm at your mercy. she said many times to Boaz, what have I done to find favor? I'm just a foreigner. You treat me as a servant, though I am not a servant, right? Like she recognized where she was at, and she was just humble and grateful. And because of that, we don't want to go too far into the next chapters, but you'll see what happens, right? And I was just so loved that in this one chapter, we get to see God loving everybody, right? He's setting up the example. He is not loving, Naomi and Ruth any less because they're women, right? He's like, nope, we got a whole book about Ruth in the Bible, right? Like, just as important, just as important. And in this time, those very patriarchal women didn't have rights. God set this up so that, they could be, taken care of. And what's great, I am going to spoiler alert a little bit here, just a little bit. Just so you guys know, Boaz and Ruth, they do get together. In the end, they do get together. I'm sorry, spoiler alert, they get together. And what's great about them getting together is they had a son. Their son's name was Obed, for those who don't know. And Obed went on to have a son. His son's name was Jesse. And Jesse went on to have a couple of sons, but one very important, which was David, right? And we know Jesus is in the line of David, right? And we have Boaz's faith here. Can you imagine as an Israelite, in Bethlehem, following God to be like, my lineage, Jesus, I'm there, there's no greater honor hardly that you could have to be like, hey, I'm in that lineage, right? Jesus is coming from me, right? And his faith was rewarded with that, right? He took pity like this, right? And then God, in his infinite wisdom, didn't choose an upstanding, Israelite woman here. It was no, this was a woman who had been married, she had been widowed, she was a Moabite, again, we don't, those people, right? And he chose her to be in the lineage of Jesus, right? And I just love that because you see her faith to follow Naomi, to choose God as her God, to do all that, and all these actions and faith that they took was rewarded with her lineage now too, is the lineage of Jesus, right? And God, it's just so amazing to me that God doesn't, if any priest or whatever back in the day had chosen Jesus' lineage, I promise it would be wildly different than what it actually is, right? We think that we know what we need. We think that we're oh, well, it should be this, and it should be this. And God's no. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. I'm, higher than you, right? I think of all this stuff. And it's nope. He chose a widowed Moabite woman from over here, right? Shows just how God's everybody is loved. There is no hey, you got to be here, you got to be there. You've got to be upstanding. You got to have done this. It's no. Widowed Moabite woman who decided to follow her mother-in-law, to leave her land, follow her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, and boom, this is the reward. And that's just God, right? That's so God. And I like to look at this, and as we go throughout the rest of the week, and to think on that and to imagine that, because I know we can feel that I can look even and see people and be well, that person would not be a candidate to reach out to. They wouldn't be interested in the Bible, or that person is, this, or that person is that. And I can have that thought, I can have that heart, and I can cherry pick who I think would be right for the Bible, right? I don't know if you guys do that. Is that just me, or do you guys do that? I cherry pick who I think would be open and receptive, and who I think would be in. And usually it's not the unhoused person. Usually it's not, the person who probably needs it most. I'm well, this person looks like they've got their life together. They could probably use Jesus, right? And it's that's not fair. That's not what God shows us here. That's not what Boaz did. A foreign woman. He had pity on her and gave her all the other stuff. And it just thinks. I wrote down here. It says, at every turn, God goes against what we would think appropriate. Jesus' lineage is full of God showing love to the unlovable and undesirable. Jesus continues that tradition, loving the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the lepers, and breaking social norms. Ruth is just another great example of this love and a reminder to us to not get caught up in the ought-tos and shoulds and instead lead in faith and love. So as we go out the rest of our week, just remember, what you see is not what God sees. Lead with faith and love, and I think our world will be greatly impacted. I know Dover will be greatly impacted if each and every one of us lead with that. Amen. Thank you so much.